The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O God, whose Son Jesus is the good shepherd of your people, grant that when we hear his voice, we may know him who calls us by name and follow where he leads, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns one God forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
And this is Good Shepherd Sunday, the fourth Sunday in Lent. So I want to read the 23rd Psalm, and this is a translation by Robert Alter, and it's a little different than the King James, and he says in the notes that he tries to stay close to the Hebrew poetry and as close as he can to the meaning of the Hebrew. So the 23rd Psalm, a David Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In grass meadows he makes me lie down, by quiet waters guides me. My life he brings back, he leads me on paths of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a table before me in the face of my foes. You moisten my head with oil, my cup overflows. Let but goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days. Amen. Wow. Lovely. I am always thrilled to have Paul here, have you with us today. This is, I think, your third trip here.
Third trip here, yeah.
You have done Job,
Job,
and you've done Genesis, or the prophets.
The prophets,
and
yeah.
Today Genesis.
Genesis.
Very good. You are a delight. I think, I bet if Ted, when he was a young man going into college, if he had heard you, he would have ended up being an Old Testament scholar.
Never know.
You
Only if.
Only if.
you bring, wonderful meaning and relevance to texts that sometimes we think are just sort of, what those mean, they're so long ago and far away, and you bring them very, very close. So it's a real pleasure to have you to talk about Genesis this morning. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure to be back. I almost feel like it's home now. So I thank you for inviting me back. Thank you for being here. I like to have intimate conversations centered around the Bible. So this is perfect. So the topic for today will be language in Genesis. I think I've shared before. Some of you are here. I recognize faces. I love languages. I love thinking about the function and the power of language and the way it shapes our thoughts, our actions, and the world in which we live. And I feel like language is even more important now to think about critically than it has ever been. I say this because of the way in which we use language in our lives as well as in our world. So I wanted to think about language, and I want to frame this conversation by introducing two quotes from modern authors. This first one is from Jerome Bruner, who is a psychologist, and he thinks about the ways in which human beings use language. And the title of the book is Actual Minds and Possible Worlds. And it thinks about the fact that we use language in order to create possible worlds in which to inhabit and also in which to inhabit with others. And he says, Aristotle puts the conclusion well. The poet's function is to describe not the thing that has happened, but of things that might happen, i.e. what is possible as being probable or necessary. So we use language like this all the time. Scott Ted, I believe, Well, if you had met me when you were a young man, you might have taken a different trajectory. So that's a possible world that could have happened. It obviously didn't, to the blessing of everybody around you in your life. But there's a possible world that we create through the use of language. So Aristotle says we use our language to both create possibilities and then to inhabit them, right? And then he says, perhaps this is why tyrants so hate and fear poets and novelists, and yes, historians, even more than they fear and hate scientists, who, though they create possible worlds, leave no place in them for possible alternative personal perspectives on those worlds. He was writing in 1986. I don't know what he was reading. He may have been reading George Orwell's 1984. This will connect back to Genesis in a bit. George Orwell, in the famous novel 1984, has the character Winston do this. He writes, he dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small, clumsy letters, he wrote. April 4th, 1984. Right? And yet, this act of writing for Winston in the novel is a decisive act, precisely because writing is illegal, right? In this world, and for him to write something that is private, something that is not known to the governmental powers, was an act of defiance, was an act of rebellion, was an act of resistance, which to a certain extent ensures that he will in fact be killed by the end of the novel. Right? So this very act of just simply writing April 4th, 1984 is described as the decisive act. I'm not here to talk about George Orwell or about psychology because I don't know a lot about those things. I'm a biblical scholar. So we're going to talk about Genesis. What does this have to do with Genesis? The book of Genesis has many authors. And the author, or the group of authors who likely wrote Genesis 1, which is the account of creation that begins when God began creating the heavens and the earth, was written probably during the Babylonian Empire. So we can think about this act of writing as an act that happened within the situation of empire when the Israelites, when the Jews were in Babylon and were in fact being an oppressed people. Scholars disagree, as they have to make a living. So there are new ideas that arise and say, oh, no, this wasn't written in the exilic period. It was written in the Persian period when the Persian Empire sent the Jews back home and said, write a new constitution to constitute a new society. Wherever you place this writing, you have to think about the writing of Genesis 1 as an act that happened within empire, either against or under the authorization of empire, but one that hoped to begin a new possibility, one that said, we live in this particular political, social, economic situation, but how are we to begin to imagine a life that is new, a life that is different? And the way they did that was by simply writing. And they went all the way back to creation and decided to rewrite the world so that new worlds could be possible to imagine. Right? So I think if you read Genesis 1 in this light, we can think of this as writing in empire, writing in many respects against empire, as we will see. So Genesis 1, the decisive act, okay? This is going to be shocking, okay? Because of course, this is very familiar to all of you. I've translated this slightly differently, but you probably are familiar with in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Most modern biblical scholars think that it's probably better or more correct to translate as when God began to create the heavens and heaven and earth, or the heavens and the earth. Okay, so this group of writers in exile, an oppressed people, or at least a people who are being legitimized and sent under the authority of an empire to resettle a plot of land, begins when God began to create heaven and earth. This should be, for them, the decisive act. The earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of deep. I didn't say the deep, but we'll get back to that, of deep. And the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. What do you notice here? Do you see anything odd or things that you have questions about?
Well, if it wasn't formless, and how was there water?
How was there water?
Yeah, if it wasn't formless.
Yeah.
Yeah, the earth was void. How was the water?
Right.
Well, we don't know what void and darkness means. Like tohu vabohu, we don't really know exactly what that means. So void is one way that we've tried to translate it, but obviously it can be formless with water, but not void. So perhaps something like
So the deep, what is the face of the deep? That is
face of deep.
face
Yeah,
of deep. That to me
Yeah.
is a little.
yeah. So
Deep
yeah.
what? Yeah.
deep what? Yeah. The deep is the Hebrew word is tehom, and we think that it's related to the Akkadian word tiamat, which also means deep, and it's referring to like the deep sea. But here it's not the deep. You expect for the deep ha to home. So to home maybe it probably is a reference to Tiamat, which is the goddess of the sea. Right, in Babylonian mythology, it is referring to the chaos sea, and in the Babylonian myth of creation, Tiamat, to whom or deep, right? Her name would be just deep, was killed as the first act of creation. But here it just kind of appears not as a mythological divine being, but simply as deep, right? As part of the stuff that pre-existed the act of God's creating. Like when God began creating, there were all these things. Yeah.
When stands out to me, because when you use the word when, it's almost like God is choosing that time.
Yeah.
It's this deliberate.
Yeah. So it's a point in time, right? It's not in the beginning, but in the beginning is defined by the fact that God began to create. And before this beginning happened, there was formlessness, there was tohu vabohu, right? Void and darkness, and deep Tiamat, something like the carcass, or something that reminds the readers of the mythological goddess of chaos. Right? What else do you see?
Well, it was darkness and there was no sun.
Yeah, there was no light. Yeah. So this is a situation in which there is no darkness. There is no light. Right.
Began with it has a continuance to it.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
Right.
When God was already there.
God was still there. Well, yeah.
He
Elohim.
was before this
Yeah.
moment.
So if we imagine this being written, for example, during the Babylonian exile, people would have been shocked that it's not Marduk who creates, right? So to say that Elohim, right, this God creates, is to deny that Marduk, who was known to be the creator god in Babylonian mythology, is not the creator. So this is, in a small way, by simply writing Elohim instead of Marduk, is saying, I don't believe in the ideology of the empire, right? And it also, by saying to whom is part of the messy stuff that pre-existed creation, is also denying that a battle needs to happen, that Marduk, the god, the head god, the creator god, has to kill something like Tiamat in order for creation to happen. So already there's a denial of the mythology of the empire, and also denying that there is any kind of battle that is necessary for creation to happen.
So that would have been the tradition that the Jews in Babylon
Would have been
taught.
Mhm. Yeah,
And so that was, if you will, that was the truth
right.
before they redefined the truth.
Yeah. So the Babylonian, during the exile, every year, every New Year, they would have celebrated a celebration of the myth of Marduk killing Tiamat at the beginning of creation. Right. So simply writing this is saying, I deny whatever you were trying to tell me and to kind of inculcate me. So it is to a certain extent, it's a beginning that's so familiar to us, but if we read it within the political atmosphere of the Babylonian Empire, you would have been shocked. Like, don't say this out loud in public. They might come and get you, right? Because the Babylonians will not like what you're trying to say here, right? Denying Marduk kingship, denying the mythology that undergirds their sense of what it means to be a Babylonian.
Paul, what story did they arrive in Babylon with? What did they come with? What was it? Did they have a creation story that they came with?
It's unclear, but there were many other kind of creation accounts that were endemic to Canaan. So the Babel cycle is one such example of trying to understand how the world might have come to be, or how the world has life within it. So we are all familiar with Baal, like the idol that you're not supposed to worship in the ancient world in Israel. Baal would have been the kind of head young god who defeats a deity called Yam. Yam literally just simply means sea. And that's the case in Hebrew as well as in Ugaritic. And so Baal would defeat Yam, who is causing all kinds of trouble, all kinds of chaos, creating sea monsters, dragons, basically, like Leviathan. You've heard of that name. In Ugaritic is Litanu, right? And Tanin, like just dragons everywhere. And Baal would be the one responsible for killing Yam, and therefore reestablishing order. And then Baal is the one who sends rain clouds so that the earth can produce food, right? Rain. So that likely was something that the Israelites had familiarity with, and there are indications within the Old Testament that tells us that the Israelites had a version of that also within that. Yeah.
So were the tribes of Israel all in agreement in terms of what they were thinking?
I don't think so.
So they came with different stories.
They may have had different versions. I mean, I think this mythology would have been part of their cultural kind of background, but not everybody would have had the same version or known the same thing. Right? Yeah. So this is the first act, I think, and then this happens, and God said, "Let there be light," and God said, because there's darkness, as you said, and I love this passage. Um, and I think it's a remarkable passage because God creates, again, not by fiat, not by deed, not by battle, but by simply speaking, right? And here we have kind of an evaluation of the value and the power of language. Let's see. Yeah. And and it's an act of language that I think that not only tells us that God uses language, but also empowers any kind of human acts of language as well. And we'll see about that. And what else does the Genesis writer do with simply writing this creation account? Let's see. Oh, let there be light, and there was light. If this were only true about my life, right? Let my child behave, and he behaved, or let my students do all their homework, and they did. But it is an indication that to use language, to use language is in fact an act of creation. This is an example. This is a small example. This is not fall. This is hopefully something like spring. But in the fall, when the leaves change color, I used to think that the leaves changed into red and yellow and brown. But then when my child was maybe like 3, 4 years old, he looked around the trees and said, purple. I see purple, like purple leaves. And I've never seen purple leaves. But from that time on, I saw purple leaves. And so this act of description made purple a reality. And every act of language that we enact is not as powerful as let there be light, and there was light. But there is always a sense in which we, in fact, create the things that we describe. When we describe a community as loving, we begin to inhabit that community. If we imagine a family that is outwardly focused and is willing to serve, we begin to create that reality. So this is an indication of the power of language that I think that the book of Genesis begins to teach us, that language itself is creative, and to simply describe something is in fact to approach creating it. What does God create? Yeah.
So when they wrote this, was it because there was an absence of science that could explain it?
Absence of science. Well, they didn't. Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if you're trying to explain the unknown,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
But you realize there has to be some explanation, right? And you really don't necessarily, back then, it's not like they had, the internet to find out the answers to everything that was going on, right?
Yeah.
There probably weren't even text or scrolls, or maybe there were tablets, but the vast majority of people weren't even probably literate, right?
Yeah.
So what they were doing was giving an explanation to something that they couldn't explain, which was how is where we are been happened.
Yeah. I think they were trying to describe the beginnings, kind of the framework of what it means to be creation, right? So they didn't give us a scientific language about it.
Because they didn't have scientific.
Those were not the ways in which they thought,
Right,
but rather they thought in terms of God acting.
right.
And here I think they had mythologies, right, that they inherited from their own tradition, the ones that the Babylonians would have given them. And they, to a certain extent, rejected that and said, this is the way we choose to understand and frame the reality in which we live. Yeah. Yeah. So another thing, we mentioned dragons before, and in Genesis 1, verse 21, your translations will say something maybe a little different. But it says, and God created the great dragons and every living creature that moves of every kind, ... The Hebrew, I wonder, you're looking it up. What does your translation say?
It says, so God created the great sea monsters.
It's okay. At least they have sea monsters.
Yeah, this is,
And the rest, yeah.
noon,
I think some others would have like the great whale or the great fish or something like this. But the correct translation is either monsters or dragons, right? Tanin, the great Tanin. These are things like Leviathan, things like Rahab, the kind of the dragons that you see elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible and other mythological texts. So the things that used to, in other mythological explanations of creation, threatened order and life, God, here the writers simply say, God created them. They simply become one of the creatures. And what's even more shocking to some extent is the verse that follows. And God blessed them. You blessed the dragons, God. And not only blessed them with specifically with this blessing or this command, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas. Right? God says to the dragons, multiply, right, and fill the earth. Yeah.
I noticed it said that it only talked about, it said with and which the waters swarm and every winged bird of every kind. That kind of like suggests that it was only talking about the sea animals and birds. Is there like a separate area? Is that just the translation, or was it also not talking about land creatures?
Yeah. God creates other land animals in a different section on a different day. Yeah. Good observation. It's not simply the sea and the skies, but God will get to the land creatures later. Yeah. God didn't forget about them. Yeah. So simply by this act of writing, God says, God creates dragons and God blesses them, which would have been, I think, a shock to the Babylonians and also to the Israelites, who would have not wanted to see dragons multiply in the sea. But the claim here is that this God created such a world of order and life that even the dragons can multiply and be a peaceful part of creation. Robinson, I think this is Marilyn Robinson, who said, against this background of ambient myth, the mythologies of the Babylonians as well as the Canaanite mythology, she says, against this background of ambient myths, to say that God is a good creator of a good creation is not a trivial statement. It's not only not a trivial statement, but I think is a profound declaration of the possibility of the newness that is being opened up by imagining that the world is good in this way, that the world is in fact not full of monsters that are out there to create chaos and cause death, but rather the world is out there full of divine grace and divine goodness. And that's something, that's a lot of boldness to claim hope of this magnitude if they are indeed working under the Babylonian exile, when they are an oppressed people, to say that we have infinite possibility before us. And here is another shocking thing that they do. They write, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish, the birds, the cattle, all the wild animals and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Anything that stands out for you in this passage? Yeah.
It says hour.
Yeah.
Why is he talking about hour?
Yeah. Yeah. Why the good catch? Yeah. So here, at least in verse 26, God seems to be talking to other divine beings. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. And this may be probably a reflection of the idea that there's a divine court with other divine beings. Yeah, and we see this in other parts of the Old Testament. If you remember in Job 1, God has, in chapter 1, there's a meeting of the divine beings where Hasatan comes up, right? And there it says that the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, assemble. And among that is Hasatan, and God is there. So God might be saying, talking to other divine beings in that way. We have something like that in 1 Kings 22, where we see that there's God, and then other divine beings, and many other places also. So here it seems to be a reflection of the idea that God is operating with a divine court of some sort. Yeah.
Why didn't that get edited? It's important, obviously.
Yeah. Well, so the priestly writers tend towards what we understand as monotheism, or at least they believe that the God, Elohim, the God of Israel, is the divine, the only God of some sort. I think it was important for the priestly writers who wrote chapter 1 to think of God in this way, to reflect this tradition, because that was the ideology of the kind of the understood world. But then I think, so this is a drama that, so 26 we have the divine court. In 27 we don't. So God created humankind in his image, right? So something happens, right? Something happens between 26 and 27. And I think this might be one way in which the priestly writers are, in fact, invoking the divine court and then killing them all, right? So some scholars have wondered about what happens between the space between verse 26 and 27. Why does the plurality of gods become a single God in 27? And God kills off, right, the other deities whom he references. This killing off the deities is reflected in a text like Psalm 82. Which says Elohim, God, takes his place in the Edat Elohim, the divine court. And he judges the Elohim. Right? So God, Elohim, judges Elohim. God judges gods. But the word for Elohim there in the Hebrew is exactly the same. And why? Why? And then the psalm goes on to say that because you have not used your knowledge of good and evil, you have not judged correctly, you have not helped the poor, the widow, the orphan, etc. Because you have failed in acting like gods. I think verse 5 or 6, it says, you are gods. You are the son of El Elyon, the Most High. But you would die like Adam. You would die like human beings. Can you read that for us? Are you there?
Verse 6, as for me, I had thought you were gods, and the sons of the Most High were you all. Yet indeed, like humans, you shall die, and like one of the princes fall.
So, so in Psalm 82, we see a scene where God is judging and killing other gods for their failure to, in fact, act like gods by judging correctly. And this seems to be a case in which God is literally killing off other gods. In Genesis, it seems like that they are doing this in the space between 26 and 27. And this may make sense if you think about the Marduk that has been displaced, Tiamat that has been displaced. There's a sense in which God is simply saying that we don't need gods because we have human beings now, right? So if you think about this as the creation of human beings in the image of God, the gods who are killed off are being replaced by human beings, and human beings are in fact, to a certain extent, being elevated to divinity. Another thing to say is that this notion that human beings are created in God's image, right, is an important factor. In the ancient Near East, not everybody was thought to bear the image of God. Only kings and high priests were understood to bear the image of God. So if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, for example, Code of Hammurabi says, I am king and I bear the image of the god of the sun, Shashamshi. So only kings and high priests bear God's image. And for the priestly writer to say, that's not true. All human beings bear God's image was a radical idea. And to say this, I think, especially if they're writing during the Babylonian exile, is shocking. It simply is saying that not only the Israelites, not only the Jews, but also our captors and everybody in the world bear God's image. And this simple idea that claimed God's image for all human beings is an idea that shaped, I think, the priestly theology and anthropology, but it's something that actually shapes our world too. Like this act of writing, this act of imagination, this theological daring, still funds a lot of the kind of legal traditions about human rights that shape our world to this day.
But that also, the opposite of that carried over into the 20th century. If you look at, Japanese culture where the emperor was considered to be divine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kings of England, right? Were considered to be divine.
Even at the time of writing, very few people would have agreed with this statement. Maybe even the Jews themselves, don't make the Babylonians the bearers of image. They would have resisted this idea. And certainly the Egyptians, the Babylonians, all the kings would have thought of themselves only as bearing God's image. But this idea, it took a long time, and it took a long time to take root, and it's still not fully realized, right? There's this idea that this possible world in which everyone bears God's image is a possible world that is still in the process of becoming true, right? God began creating this world according to the writers, but it is a world that has not been fully created yet. So I think we can appreciate this decisive act of writing, but we also realize that this is something that still needs to be achieved in many, many regards. So language and creation. I think to write, to speak, to use language, I think from here, we can say that is to act. It's not simply an act of description, but it is something that we do in this world. Within the context of empire, it can be an act of rebellion. It can be an act of resistance. If somebody tells, keeps telling you, you are a second-class citizen, you're not as worthy as the Babylonians or the Persians, to say that I bear God's image is an act of resistance against that kind of claim. And so to write, to speak, and to use language is to create. And it is something that we all participate in as human beings, as users of language. And it is something that is very powerful. And this power is something that we will see in spades in Genesis 11, in the Tower of Babel narrative. And here is the statement. Tower of Babel, as you will remember, hopefully, is when the people are spreading on the earth, and they all speak one language, and they're all afraid of something, and they all gather together to create and decide to build a tower that will hopefully reach to the heavens, and to make a name for themselves. And God looks down and says, look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. That is to say, because the people are able to communicate with one another and coordinate the efforts, this gives human beings the possibility of doing something massive, of great effect. The Tower of Babel is an interesting description. The Lord has to look down and come down even to recognize that it's there, even though human beings think of it as quite big. But God recognized that this is only the beginning of what human beings can do if they're able to coordinate this in this way. And this story, I think, is a recognition of the power of human beings when they come together, not as individual wielders of language, but a community that wields and uses language. And if have this ability to communicate with each other, they will have nothing that they cannot do. And so they confuse their language. There are many ways to kind of understand this multiplication of language. I think it's both a good thing and a bad thing. But I think from my perspective, what I want to recognize is that the power, that human beings have immense power, according to Genesis, when they're able to coordinate. And we see this in space today. And Robinson says, I propose that our conception of humankind, and she's reflecting on the Tower of Babel story. I propose that our conception of humankind is too anthropomorphic, too narrowly defined, as physical, mental, or moral, as mortal, either damned or saved, but not as the overwhelming power we are as a creature, a species. Only God himself could alter creation as we threaten to do and have done. And Robinson thinks of this episode as teaching us that human beings, when they're able to coordinate with one another, to use language with one another, has this immense creative, divine-like power. For language and human beings, language allows for human coordination, and this gives human beings near divine powers. And this is both a scary thing and also a statement about the power that language has. I think about this more and more as we enter into the age of kind of artificial intelligence. and the ways in which this type of intelligence is kind of consuming the language, the knowledge that human beings have created for us. And by making connections, is gaining immense power. I think there's immense potential there. I don't know anything about AI except for what I hear on the news. There's also immense potential to do good, but there's also immense danger for our corporate lives as human beings. And so kind of the Tower of Babel story seems to be both is a good partner with which to think about the language that we have, the power that we have, and the power that we are beginning to wield in a meaningful way with the assistance of kind of generative AI. Yeah, it's to sort of very sobering. All right. So we said we have creation. We have creative generative power when we coordinate language in the Tower of Babel. And then if you get to the Joseph story at the end, we have Joseph using language in order to manipulate and to deceive his brothers. Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt through the machinations of his brothers. And there he rises to become vice regent. But there's a famine in the land, and Joseph has succeeded in storing up grain in Egypt. So many people are flocking to Egypt to buy grain, including Joseph's brothers. But when Joseph's brothers come to him, he is in his full Egyptian garb. They're not. So Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Right? So this creates a knowledge discrepancy. And then he decides to create a fictional world by saying, Joseph said to them, his brothers, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. Right? Joseph knows that his brothers are not spies. Right? But he gives them that identity. And by simply describing them as spies, because he is powerful, they will now be treated as spies. Right? And so this act of language creates a fictional world in which he is a non-Hebrew understanding Egyptian governor, and his brothers are spies who have come to see the nakedness of the land. Even though they deny it, but because he has the power, they cannot escape this fictional world. And this is also possible because they did not know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter. So this scene, I think, is important for us to think about the ways in which simply the way we use language can be used for deception and to entrap people in different fictive worlds. Right? We hear stories of people falling in love with their artificial intelligence agents. I think there was a movie about that a while back. And more and more, our world is defined by the digital interactions that we have. I have a son. Many of you have children, young peoples in your lives, and I wonder about the world that they will live in. How much it will be defined by the language the digital language that will be created for them. And so I recognize that there is the possibility that the worlds that we live in are the creations of fictional worlds. And I worry about the ways in which it can be used for both good purposes and for bad purposes. Joseph here, some people have argued, creates this fictive world in which his brothers are spies in order to test them, in order to make sure that they have grown morally. Another, but less an interpretation that imputes bad motives for Joseph is to say that Joseph was being vengeful and wants to punish them for having treated him badly. And so we see that for either for good or for ill, the language can be used in a variety of ways, both to create and to deceive. So language in Genesis, I think, I want to conclude by saying that it can be used, it is creative. As we see God using it, it is to use language is in fact to create the things that we describe. And even though we are not gods, we cannot say, let there be light and there will be light. But even so, whenever we speak something, we are in fact creating. This is true for me as a parent, for all of us in our variety of roles. When a preacher preaches, one creates the world in which we live. Right? I create the verbal conditions in which my child lives, that my students live, and my neighbors and friends live. So it is creative, but because it is creative, it can also be deceptive, because we do not share complete understanding with one another. There's always a gap of knowledge. So we can use it to deceive in a way that is good or beneficial, but there are many times in which we can use our language to deceive in a very negative way. And that's because I think language in Genesis is a form of power. To be able to speak and to write is a form of power that we all human beings have, and therefore need to use with wisdom and with discernment. And my conclusion was is perhaps anticipated by James, who says, look at the ships, though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. That is to say, language is a powerful thing that we wield for good or for ill. And I think we, as a corporate body, whether it's the family, especially as a church, especially as a society, we do well to think more deeply about the ways in which language is used, especially in this climate of division. We can use language to create walls between us, but we can also use language to tear down those walls, to create community, to really, in fact, to affirm that you and I and everybody else is created in the image of God. And if we can use language in that way, I think we will have succeeded in participating in the creation that God began in Genesis 1. So, thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah.
Comments?
What year are we talking about 400 BC when Genesis-ish?
So Genesis chapter 1, the priestly writers, one set of dates traditionally was the 6th century BCE, like the Babylonian. If it's in the Persian period, it will be 100 or 200 years after that.
Oh,
Yeah, so 5th, 6th century, 5th or the 4th century BCE. Yeah.
400.
So then if I understand like kind of the timeline of when the Old Testament was written correctly, Genesis would actually be one of the later books that was written, is that correct?
So Genesis is a composite text, probably made up of very old traditions that may have been in fact kind of pre-monarchical, so in the second millennium, like late second millennium, but it also has texts that are very late, so like the priestly text, later like up into the 4th century BCE. Yeah, so Genesis is a complex book to date because of the many traditions that are found within it. Yeah.
So probably similar to Psalms in a way where you've got multiple different
Right.
eras represented by the
Right.
text.
Almost every single biblical book in the Hebrew Bible has that kind of complex composition of history that spans centuries, not decades or years. Yeah.
How was it decided it was in the Bible that we have the first book? If it was written, I mean, how did, I never.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a fundamental question, but I never thought.
Yeah, but I think the order of the books were probably determined by the latest kind of editors of the Bible, biblical writers, and we think that they may have been the priestly writers who decided to make the Torah, the Pentateuch, as the founding document for the Second Temple period, when the people had returned from the Babylonian exile and they were trying to reconstitute themselves. They decided to put this text together, and they began with creation. So Genesis became first, and they traced their history until they entered the land.
When was the Second Temple period?
Yeah.
When was that?
Second Temple period was after the Babylonian exile, when they came back and rebuilt the temple, which began late 6th century BCE.
Is that under
Six-
Solomon?
Solomon would have been in the 9th century, so way before that. Yeah.
To follow up on Paul's closing about how people of different views can come together. This evening at 6:30, Ryan Bird is going to be, we have a Zoom meeting with him and his new book, The Vanishing Church, which he speaks about the importance of sort of moderate churches in our world, and losing them is a big deal. So 6:30 Zoom, we're doing that with the Vienna Presbyterian Church and Arlington, so that'll be here around. Thank you very much. Thank you.